Top 10 gemstones that changed modern art forever. Not every work of art starts with an idea. Some start with a stone. Before synthetic dyes, before mass-produced paint, before digital color codes, there were minerals. Crushed, burned, smelted, hand pulverized into powders, then transformed into colors, textures, structures, and statements. Over the centuries, gemstones have been more than just worn. They have been revered. They've been used to color sacred murals, to sculpt forms of protest, to layer postmodern metaphors. Some have changed the way light is perceived. Others have changed the way entire cultures imagine power, identity, or time. In today's episode, we trace 10 gemstones that have been more than just decorative. They've shaped visual movements, birthed new materials, and pushed art beyond the box. No hype, no mystique. There is only geology, pigments, and the raw physical nature of art history itself. Ranked 10th, Quartz Crystal, minimalism's pure geometry. Not every gemstone that changed modern art came with color, symbolism, or rarity. Some did the opposite. They removed everything, leaving only the presence. Quartz crystal, a mineral so common it's often overlooked, found an unexpected place in the most silent revolution of 20th century visual culture. The minimalist movement. Its transparency, symmetry, and resistance to interpretation made it more than just a geological specimen. It became a refusal to explain. Naturally forming in six-sided prisms, quartz does not shimmer or seduce. It doesn't invite metaphor. It sits still. Its structure is governed by strict atomic order, a kind of natural architecture that aligns perfectly with minimalist ideals of precision, neutrality, and repetition. This wasn't a material to use for decoration. It was a material to expose. In the 1960s and 70s, a wave of artists turned away from the expressive storms of abstraction and toward a new kind of clarity. Their works didn't shout, they didn't gesture, they didn't demand interpretation. They were about space, shape, and material itself. Quartz, with its perfect planes and optical neutrality, offered something few other materials could: form without narrative, surface without symbol. Some artists began incorporating pure crystal into sculptural structures, installations, and light experiments. Not to evoke anything, but to be something. Unlike marble, which carried centuries of classical connotation, or precious gems, which always suggested value and power, quartz meant nothing. And in the minimalist vocabulary, that made it worthwhile. When illuminated, quartz neither swallows nor distorts. It allows light to pass, unbent and uncolored. This made it ideal for exploring the relationships between material, environment, and perception. In gallery spaces, where silence and geometry took precedence over emotional content, quartz was not hidden or disguised. Instead, it was showcased. It was revealed precisely because it did not distract. There are no grand stories attached to quartz in art history. No lost civilizations, no royal commissions. It entered the museum not through mythology, but through decision. Selected, measured, placed. As part of large installations or isolated blocks, it simply existed. And in doing so, it demanded something unusual from viewers: attention without narrative, looking without reading, presence without purpose. Today, these works remain. Some feature quartz prominently, others embed it subtly. In either case, the material resists transformation. It does not perform, it does not age, and it does not participate in spectacle. Quartz crystal didn't elevate itself to the level of art. Art reduced itself to the level of quartz. Quiet, exact, and absolute. Ranked 9th, turquoise, the decolonized blue of contemporary art. In recent decades, turquoise has become increasingly visible in contemporary indigenous art, not merely as decoration, but as a symbol of resistance. Whether in large-scale installations, abstract paintings, or mixed media pieces, the color reappears again and again, not to evoke beauty, but to reclaim it. Turquoise in the mineral is a hydrated phosphate of copper and aluminum. It lacks transparency, has slight brilliance, and has never been rare in geological terms. but its value was never geological. For thousands of years, it has held symbolic meaning across multiple civilizations: Egypt, Persia, Tibet, and, above all, the indigenous nations of the American Southwest. Long before colonization, turquoise adorned masks, offerings, and ceremonial jewelry weren't for sale. It was for identity. Then came erasure. Museums across Europe and North America displayed turquoise artifacts as primitive relics. The hands that made them, Hopi, Zuni, Navajo, were excluded. Turquoise became a commodity, mined, marketed, and detached from its cultural roots. Its meaning was rewritten, from sacred to ornamental. But in the late 20th century, that meaning began to fracture. Indigenous artists across North America started placing turquoise back where it once belonged, in cultural authorship, not in craft, in article. They used it not to imitate tradition, but to question it. In the works of John Quick-to-See Smith, color fields of turquoise are layered with newspaper clippings, maps, and treaty texts, pointing not to the land, but to what was taken from it. In the paintings of T.C. Cannon, stylized turquoise backgrounds contrast with traditional regalia worn by Native American figures, who are caught between the past and the pressures of assimilation. In these works, turquoise is not a color, it is a signal. This decolonization of color extends beyond pigment. Some artists use raw turquoise stones, broken and unpolished, laid flat on soil, mounted on steel, or submerged in acrylic. Others use synthetic turquoise, mass-produced plastic imitations, to comment on how indigenous symbols are rebranded, sold, and misunderstood. Either way, the question is the same: who owns turquoise, and who decides what it means? Today, the answer is changing. Museums no longer control the narrative alone. Turquoise appears in biennials, in activist installations, in climate art. It is no longer framed in glass cases. It is embedded in land acknowledgments, in protests, in land art pieces that physically mark borders once crossed without consent. This gemstone's power does not come from rarity, clarity, or chemical perfection. It comes from its memory, and from those who remember. Turquoise in contemporary art is not an aesthetic choice. It is a return, not to the past, but to the right to define what color means, and who gets to explain it. Ranked 8th, amber, fossil memory and postmodern symbolism. A tiny insect, perfectly preserved in resin, no movement, no decay. Its wings remain folded. Its body is weightless, suspended in golden translucence. It could be a mosquito, a gnat, a mite, but its species doesn't matter. What matters is the illusion that this is memory, fossilized. And that illusion is what postmodern art began to question. Amber is not a crystal, it is fossilized tree resin, an organic, unstable, and chemically complex substance. Formed over tens of millions of years, it traps and preserves fragments of ancient life, including insects, spores, fibers, and air bubbles. For centuries, amber has been regarded as a natural curiosity, but it wasn't until the late 20th century that it entered the artistic lexicon, not as jewelry, but as critique. In post-war Eastern Europe, artists confronted a crisis of memory. The past was no longer a stable archive. It had been rewritten, redacted, industrialized. In that context, amber was no longer a symbol of eternity. It was a container, one that could hold things, but not explain them. Artists began embedding amber into installations, not to display what it contained, but to confront the viewer with what could no longer be accessed. The object inside, an insect, a petal, a fiber, was both hyper-visible and unreachable. The past was right there, and yet completely sealed. In Germany, amber became a metaphor for collective forgetting, the Holocaust museums that preserved artifacts while suppressing effect. In Russia and Poland, artists used amber in critiques of state control over history, displaying resin blocks filled with newspaper fragments, censored photographs, or shredded family archives. These works didn't glorify amber. They weaponized it. It was not about memory. It was about the impossibility of memory under systems that curate what can be remembered. The Western avant-garde took a different path. Some conceptual artists used synthetic amber, identical in color and texture, but manufactured in labs, to question whether memory itself could be faked. Others suspended contemporary objects in resin, including SIM cards, pills, and cigarette butts. The message was clear. What we preserve is often meaningless, and what has meaning is rarely maintained. Amber became a double critique of nostalgia and of the materials we trust to carry meaning forward. Its beauty was part of the trap. Its transparency suggested honesty. But the more artists worked with it, the more they revealed. Amber is not a window to the past. It is a wall. Today, amber still appears in postmodern installations, but its function has changed. It is not about preservation. It is about interrogation. Not about what we remember, but why and who controls the act of remembering. In that sense, amber is not a time capsule. It is a challenge. Not to the fossil trapped inside, but to the viewer standing outside. Ranked 7th, hematite, the red core of printmaking and sculpture. Among all iron-bearing minerals, hematite stands out not for brilliance, but for weight, optical, physical, and historical. In its raw form, it gleams metallic gray, with subtle silver flashes across layered planes. But when ground, it transforms. The hardness yields to a velvet matte red, fine as dust but heavier than most pigments known to art. Hematite is iron oxide, one of Earth's most abundant minerals and one of the few capable of carrying both structural mass and chromatic intensity. Its presence predates civilization, yet it has never lost relevance. From its early use as body adornment in Neolithic burial sites to its later role in symbolic architecture, hematite has served more than just as an ornament. It defines surface and core simultaneously. Unlike precious stones that rely on clarity, hematite is opaque to light. It absorbs rather than reflects, pulling vision inward. Its color, once liberated from the host rock, is dense and earthy. Red, not from flame or fruit, but from oxidized geology itself. The powder doesn't shimmer, it anchors. This is not a gemstone designed to dazzle across a gallery wall. It becomes the wall, the pigment, the material memory beneath the final layer of paint. As a gem, hematite has been carved, cabochon polished, and inset into rings, amulets, and talismans across various civilizations. Often chosen not for its rarity, but for its grounding presence. It is smooth to the touch yet feels immovable, cool yet resonant. Even unworked, hematite conveys stability. It rarely fractures cleanly. It resists quick cuts. In every form it retains density, visually and literally. In sculptural contexts, raw hematite appears as a weight-bearing anchor. It has been used as a counterpoint to more reflective materials, not to compete, but to quiet them. Its magnetic properties, though weak in comparison to magnetite, add to its scientific intrigue. Yet in gemstone usage, that magnetic subtlety is symbolic primarily. It holds space rather than drawing attention. More than any other iron-rich gem, hematite bridges two worlds, the mineral world and the human world. It does not glow under ultraviolet light. It does not refract color through crystalline prisms. And yet, in powdered form, it became one of the most enduring reds in the global pigment lineage. Stable, archival, iron-based permanence. The same chemical body that anchors Earth became the visual core of the surface. In the taxonomy of gems, hematite is often miscategorized, dismissed as too industrial, too familiar, too opaque. But it is precisely those qualities that give it permanence. In a world of ephemeral lusters and market-driven scarcity, hematite remains unbothered. It does not align with the trend. It remains embedded in pigment jars, tucked into carving blocks, or displayed as polished convex domes that reflect the room without revealing themselves. Unlike other red stones, ruby with its crystalline fire, spinel with its high refractive charm, hematite carries no illusion. Its red is darker, sedimented, less light, more weight. And unlike softer earth pigments that fade or flake, hematite stays. In paper, on clay, in oil, in stone, it stains, and once it's there, it doesn't leave. Today, hematite continues to circulate, not through auctions or vaults, but through tools, workshops, and the physical realities of making. It doesn't signal status. It doesn't imply mythology. What it offers is certainty, a red formed by geologic pressure, refined by force, and never pretending to be more than what it is. A stone not remembered for its shine, but for its refusal to disappear. Ranked sixth, Malachite, Soviet palaces to Western Cubism. You step into a room, every surface, floor, column, wall, is covered in greenstone. The patterns shift and curl like smoke frozen in rock. No two lines repeat. No single point offers rest. This is malachite, not as jewelry, but as architecture. And in the 19th and 20th centuries, it became one of the most politically charged gemstones in modern visual history. Geologically, malachite is a copper carbonate, soft and opaque, that forms in oxidized deposits. Its swirling bands of green, ranging from acid bright to forest dark, give it a visual complexity unmatched by most ornamental stones. It has no crystalline clarity. It doesn't refract light. Instead, it absorbs it, spreading it across undulating curves and lines. That made it ideal for walls, for columns, for surfaces of power. In Imperial Russia, malachite became the material of sovereign display. Tsarist architects lined entire chambers, tables, fireplaces, even domes, in carefully cut malachite veneer. These rooms weren't functional. They were visual declarations. After the revolution, the Soviet regime inherited the aesthetic and repurposed it. State buildings, opera halls, and military academies in the USSR continued to use malachite, especially from the Urals, not for nostalgia, but for the continuity of spectacle. Green marble wasn't soft, it was strategic. The logic of malachite, its endless fragmentation, its inability to form a single cohesive pattern, found unexpected echoes in the Cubist movement. Artists like Braque and Picasso, though not working with stone, replicated malachite's visual effect. Fractured planes, repeated rhythms, spatial instability. The painting surface became architectural, a place not to depict depth, but to build it. Western painters did not use malachite pigment, as it was chemically unstable and lost its color under light. But they were referencing its structure. The resemblance is visible in the early collages of analytical cubism. Green-gray forms overlapping at hard angles, dense fields without hierarchy. In a way, cubism's surface logic was anti-perspective. Just as malachite resisted a central vanishing point, the viewer's eye had nowhere to settle. That instability, first used to awe, was now used to fracture. This wasn't accidental. The early 20th century was a time when artists were searching for alternatives to realism, not only in what they painted, but how the surface itself behaved. The malachite aesthetic, a surface that drew attention to its own construction, became a conceptual bridge between architecture and painting. In later decades, particularly in post-Soviet art, malachite was revisited, this time not as material or reference, but as critique. Artists began photographing, sampling, and even simulating malachite interiors to examine how design could be used to dominate the space. In these works, the stone was no longer beautiful. It was ideological, a texture of controlled complexity. Today, malachite continues to appear in contemporary installation art, often in an ironic manner. Some use malachite wallpaper to mimic the interiors of state buildings. Others digitally generate malachite surfaces to comment on how luxury, surveillance, and control can now be simulated as well as built. It's no longer about the stone. It's about what it used to do. Ultimately, malachite was never neutral. Its geometry was not just natural, it was weaponized. First by monarchs, then by regimes, and finally by artists who learned to dismantle the same systems of power by fragmenting them from within. Ranked fifth, Obsidian, primal minimalism in sculpture. A block of black glass stands motionless in the center of a white room. It reflects, but it doesn't reveal. You can't see through it. You can't see inside it. You only see your own outline, stretched and distorted, across a surface that refuses to explain anything. This is obsidian, a material formed in heat, solidified in stillness, and carved into silence. Obsidian is not crystalline. It forms when volcanic lava cools too quickly to organize. What results is volcanic glass, smooth, hard, breakable, and visually absolute. The black isn't the depth, it's density. When cut, it produces edges sharper than steel, but in sculpture, it's rarely sharpened. It's held as volume. In modern art, obsidian entered not through myth, but through presence. Sculptors chose it not for its history, but for its resistance to the passage of time. It could not be decoded. It held no color, no image, no transparency. It was the opposite of symbolism, a substance that refused to be more than what it was. Placed in a gallery, obsidian does something few stones can. It reflects without revealing. Its surface offers the illusion of clarity, but it shows nothing beneath. That creates tension. Viewers expect to read an artwork. Obsidian offers no entry, only surface, only mass. That surface, however, is never flat. The flow lines of molten rock are frozen into irregular waves. Light doesn't settle on it. It fractures, bounces, curves. As viewers move, the object doesn't change, but their relationship to it does. That's what sculptors began to exploit. Not the stone's content, but its refusal to contain anything at all. Unlike marble or bronze, obsidian needs no historical framing. It doesn't refer. It doesn't decorate. It interrupts. In minimalist sculpture, that interruption becomes critical. Obsidian blocks stand where interpretation is expected, and instead deliver a void. Not absence, not loss. Just material that doesn't ask to be touched, understood, or elevated. In contemporary practice, some artists work obsidian into negative space, embedding it into concrete, aligning it with steel, or isolating it in glass vitrines. Others leave it raw, uncut, opaque, matte. What matters isn't the finish, it's refusal. Obsidian doesn't glow, doesn't refract, doesn't transform. It sits, and in that stillness, it becomes a visual discipline. Even in jewelry, obsidian defies preciousness. It is used widely, priced modestly, and rarely celebrated in auction houses. But in sculpture, its value is inverse. It carries no cultural weight, and that weightlessness becomes a force, a visual gravity, not in price, but in effect. Today, obsidian is found in museums, private collections, and open-air installations, often without labels, without context. It doesn't need either, because nothing inside it explains what it is, and no attempt to explain it can replace what it does: stand, reflect, absorb, and remain. Ranked fourth, Opal, optical surrealism in 1960s. Psychedelia. You tilt the stone, just slightly. Within a fraction of a second, colors erupt. Green folds into violet, orange dissolves into blue. The light doesn't bounce off its surface. It fragments inside. This is not an illusion, it's diffraction. This is opal. Unlike crystalline gems, which bend light through refraction, opals disrupt light through their unique structure. Its internal silica spheres, stacked in near-perfect grids, split white light into spectral colors. That interference creates motion where there is none. The effect, known as play of color, is not on the surface. It happens within. In the 1960s, a new kind of art emerged, one less interested in form and more concerned with perception. Psychedelic art didn't aim to represent reality. It aimed to destabilize it. Posters shimmered, lines vibrated, colors inverted. And while few artists worked directly with opal, its optical behavior became a template, a reference point for how matter could interact with light to confuse, seduce, overwhelm. The parallels were not accidental. Opal's color shift mirrored the mental shifts artists were trying to evoke. Its refusal to stay still mimicked the visual distortions explored in psychedelic design. Whether projected in clubs, printed on vinyl covers, or painted in fluorescent spirals, the language of opal, layered color, unpredictable transitions, light bending in place, was everywhere. Unlike the saturated flatness of traditional pigment, opal offered dimensional instability. That became key in light-based installations. Artists began working with mirrored foils, refractive plastics, and oil-based lenses, not to copy opal, but to achieve the same contradiction: a material that looks like movement and a surface that behaves like an illusion. While lapis suggested depth and diamond symbolized clarity, opal rejected definition. Its color was conditional, a product of angle, source, and environment. There was no fixed hue, no singular identity. This mirrored the ethos of 1960s visual experimentation, the breakdown of binaries, the fluidity of form. Technically, opals cannot be replicated, but visually its effect could be chased. Artists developed analog techniques to simulate spectral flow, silkscreen overlays, heat-reactive dyes, and even micro-prism coatings. These weren't gemstone imitations. They were artificial optical fields, tuned to behave like natural ones. Today, opal continues to influence motion graphics, immersive environments, and experimental film. Some digital artists scan opal interiors to model the behavior of light in virtual scenes. Others build projection surfaces that mimic opal's unstable refractions, where color seems to be coated with motion itself. Opal remains unique among gems, not for its rarity or hardness, but for how it translates light into uncertainty. Its presence in modern visual culture has never been direct, but its physics shaped an era, and its physics still challenge the boundary between surface and sensation. Ranked third, Spinel. Revolution in color theory. Every painter needs red, but for centuries red was a problem. Vermilion was vivid but poisonous. Carmine was deep but fragile. Red lead was stable but muted. Artists learned to mix, layer, and compensate. But they didn't trust the color. It flaked, it darkened, it faded. It didn't last. Then came Spinel. In the early 20th century, scientists discovered that synthetic versions of two gemstones, Spinel and ruby, could be transformed not into jewels, but into pigment. By firing precise ratios of magnesium, aluminium, and chromium at high temperatures, they produced a red unlike anything before it. Dense, non-toxic, light-fast, and chemically stable. It was red without compromise. Spinel, a natural mineral often confused with ruby, had long been overlooked in gemology, but in material science it became essential. Unlike traditional pigments, Spinel red did not oxidize. It did not bleed into adjacent colors. It did not react to acids, bases, or ultraviolet light. It held. Ruby, when synthetically created, carried the same chromium-based red, but in a corundum structure. Its contribution wasn't just chromatic, it was symbolic. The reframing of the gemstone as a source, not a surface. These were no longer materials for ornament. They became the backbone of color theory. The adoption was quiet but irreversible. Museums began accepting Spinel red as an archival-safe material. Printmakers used it for edition work meant to last centuries. Ceramicists fired it into glazes that could survive industrial furnaces. Designers integrated it into systems where consistency wasn't optional. It was critical. This wasn't just a new pigment. It was a new philosophy of color. The arrival of Spinel and ruby-based reds marked a shift from expressive pigments to engineered spectrums. Artists were no longer bound by the instability of organic dyes or the danger of heavy metals. They were given a red they could calibrate, repeat, and rely on. More than visual power, this red brought procedural confidence. The pigment was particulate, not fluid. It sat on the canvas with weight. It could be measured, not just felt. And in modern visual culture, where fidelity, consistency, and replication mattered more than aura, this shift was foundational. Today, synthetic spinel pigments extend beyond red. Chromium-doped greens, cobalt-based blues, each is derived from crystal structures once used in jewelry, now pulverized and recontextualized. These materials aren't imitations, they're evolutions. The stone doesn't decorate the image, it becomes the image. Few viewers consider the origin of pigment, but in every red that endures, in oils, in inks, in vitrives under museum lighting, there is a trace of Spinel, a gemstone broken on purpose, not for beauty, but for permanence. Not to sparkle, but to stay. Ranked second, diamond dust. Andy Warhol's glittering statement. Diamond dust doesn't sparkle like a gemstone. It doesn't refract light in facets or sit in velvet boxes. It's what's left after the cut, industrial waste, abrasive powder, residue from manufacturing. But in the 1980s, it made its way onto gallery walls, not hidden beneath paint, but spread openly across the surface. The material was no longer an error, it was the finish. In its physical form, diamond dust is angular, colorless, and violently reflective. Unlike glitter, which bends and shimmers, diamond dust strikes, flashes, punctuates. It doesn't twinkle, it fractures light. The surface it creates isn't soft. It's cold, sharp, commercial. Warhol used it deliberately. In a series of silkscreen prints, shoes, drag performers, queens, icons, he applied diamond dust not as a highlight, but as a coat. The dust didn't frame the subject, it consumed it. Faces disappeared under the glare. Outlines dissolved into brightness. These weren't portraits. They were commodities. Diamond dust became the texture of spectacle. It lacked the symbolic weight of gold leaf and the narrative density of oil. But it delivered something else. Instant attraction. Under gallery lights, it performed. Not for permanence, for attention. The dust came from synthetic diamonds, industrial grade, chemically identical to the real thing, but useless for adornment. Too small, too irregular, too flawed. And that's why they worked. Warhol didn't want rarity. He wanted to shine on command. Repeatable luster. A surface that said value without needing to explain it. In that way, diamond dust reversed the traditional role of gemstones in art. It wasn't a treasure to be represented. It was a substance used to describe what was already fake. Celebrity, consumerism, brand image. The viewer wasn't asked to admire the subject. They were asked to be drawn in by the shimmer, and then question why. Critics debated whether it was satire or sincerity. Warhol never clarified. That was the point. The dust was real, the figures were printed, the shine was seductive, the meaning was layered, commercial, repeatable. Today, diamond dust is still used in fashion prints, luxury packaging, and limited edition art objects. It holds no aura, but it grabs attention. And in a visual economy, that's enough. It doesn't age. It doesn't degrade. It doesn't deepen. It stays on the surface, by design. In the end, diamond dust is not about the gem. It's about the idea of the gem, flattened, multiplied, and sold back to the viewer as a reflection. Not of value, but of desire. And that surface still sells. In first place, Lapis Lazuli, the sacred blue that birthed ultramarine. To produce just a few grams of pure blue, entire stones had to be crushed. The lapis was broken, ground by hand, rinsed with lye, filtered through cloth, dried and ground again. The goal wasn't pigment, it was precision. Out of kilograms of rock, only a thread-fine portion became usable color. That color had a name, ultramarine. Lapis lazuli, a metamorphic stone composed mainly of lazurite, was not sought for clarity, brilliance, or size. It was mined for what it could become. And what it became was the most expensive pigment in the history of European painting. Mined almost exclusively from the Sarisang mines in northeastern Afghanistan, traded across empires and refined by master colormen in Venice and Bruges, lapis was not just a material, it was a procedure. Before synthetic dyes, color was a labor-intensive process. And blue, true blue, was the most elusive of all. Other pigments existed, including azurite, indigo, and smalt. But none matched the chromatic density or archival permanence of lapis-based ultramarine. It didn't just cover the surface, it altered the light on the canvas. Once applied, it didn't sink or scatter. It hovered. During the Renaissance, the use of ultramarine was rationed. Patrons specified it in contracts. Artists used it sparingly, often only for the robes of the Virgin or the halos of saints. Its presence was not aesthetic, it was theological. Blue was not the sky, it was what lay beyond it. In modern times, the stone lost its monopoly. Synthetic ultramarine was created in the 19th century, chemically similar, optically convincing, economically efficient, but the original remained unmatched in presence. And in the 1960s, it returned in full force, not as pigment, but as a statement. Yves Klein didn't paint with ultramarine. He painted ultramarine. He worked with color technicians to create a binding medium that wouldn't dull the pigment's intensity. The result was International Klein Blue, not a brand, but a reinstatement, a color treated as object, as entity, as environment. The stone, once reduced to powder, was re-elevated into the atmosphere. But even Klein's blue, radical in form, remained rooted in lapis. Not chemically run, but conceptually. The idea that color is earned, not found. That brilliance requires transformation. That pigment can outlast the image. Lapis Lazuli isn't rare geologically, but as a visual foundation, it is singular. It built the visual hierarchy of Western sacred art. It defined what could be seen and who was worthy of seeing it. Unlike gold, which reflects, lapis absorbs, it doesn't announce itself. It waits to be revealed under light. Today, lapis still exists in its original form, cut, polished, and stored as a mineral. However, its influence extends far beyond jewelry or sculpture. It resides in tubes of oil paint, in fresco restorations, and in digital color libraries. Not as a metaphor, as evidence. Because every modern blue, every spectral gradient, every hypersaturated hue descends from a single process, the act of breaking open stone, of refining earth until it yields light. The history of modern art isn't only a record of styles and names, it's a history of material, of what was chosen, what was crushed, melted, layered, or left visible. The stones in this list were never rare for rarity's sake. They weren't elevated for sparkle, but for what they enabled: new contrasts, new surfaces, new ways to challenge what art could feel like, and what it could endure. From the sacred blue of lapis to the optical defiance of opal, these minerals didn't just support a movement. They informed us. And long after gallery walls are repainted or theories replaced, the physical imprint of those stones, their texture, density, resistance, remains embedded in the work. Not because they were precious, but because they were used.